Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NASM Live. My name's Prentiss, and I'm here, as always, with Wendy and Marty. How are you all doing today?
Great.
Great, thank you.
All right. Outstanding. So we're moving right along through the CES four-step process. And today we're going to talk about activation and integration techniques. And just to review, CES essentially is what you're trying to do with your clients is build a targeted flexibility, strength training program, which can be a workout all by itself. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that in upcoming today or in upcoming webinars, or it can be fashioned as part of your warm-up when you start working your clients through the phases of the OPT model. So let's get started. Marty, can you give us an overview of what activation is? What is it? Why do we do it?
Sure. So activation is we're really trying to wake up those and target those littler muscles or those muscles that tend to become weak due to the overactivity of other muscles, and just try to, like I always like to describe it, as get them ready to participate, get them to understand that they have a role in human movement. And we want to get those muscles moving so that way, as we get into more complicated movement patterns, we can eliminate compensations. We can eliminate muscles that have to work for those ones that aren't playing nice. So I always explain this as, generally speaking, a lot of the muscles that my clients didn't even know they maybe had. Like when I start talking about the anterior tibialis and the posterior tibialis, and a lot of little postural muscles, mid trap, low trap. When I get into the glutes, they know glute max, glute medius, but that may not be their primary focus. They are there to work more of the prime movers and the things that they either want to see change cosmetically or they are accustomed to training. So we're just trying to make sure that all the muscles are fired up, ready to do what they need to do. So as we get into the more complicated movement patterns of the integration that Wendy will talk about, that they're doing their role, so we get better movement patterns.
Outstanding. And I'm just going to jump right in and ask a question or have you make a statement regarding this. When we talk about getting these muscles that are identified as underactive ready to play nice with the other muscles in a pattern, as in most of our human movements, can you explain what potentially happens when that breaks down? I'm thinking more about synergistic dominance and that whole cascade of things that happen.
Yep. So regardless of how efficiently you're moving, you're going to move, right? So when we're doing assessments or exercises, if you ask someone to squat, if you ask someone to push, if you ask someone to pull, if they're not doing efficiently, they're going to find their most efficient way to do it. Doesn't mean that it's the most efficient way biomechanically or from the proper movement sequencing that we're supposed to do. So when those muscles aren't activated and they're not ready to do their role, we find compensations. And within that compensation, we all know about the cumulative injury cycle that can then happen because we have more stress into the body than we're supposed to. But as you were talking about, some muscle is going to pick up the work. Somebody's going to say, hey, if you're not doing your job, I'll do it. And that's where we talk about synergistic dominance. So an example that we use all the time is if my hip flexor is the one that's overactive, that means my glute max is now underactive. So we would have to activate that in the right steps, of course, but we're focused on activation right now. But if I don't activate it and I haven't done the other two steps, especially in addition to that, when I now go to do a squat or go to do a lunge or something else, another muscle is going to have to pick up the slack. Whether it's the hamstring complex, the erector spinae, the adductor magnus, these synergists that are there to assist that motion, but not to do the bulk of it, they have to pick up the slack. And now all you're doing is getting somebody stronger at moving inefficiently. And now those muscles that are not designed to take that amount of stress are working harder than they're supposed to. And this is where sometimes you'll see someone pull a hamstring or be sore in certain parts of their body because they moved as efficiently as they could, but not as efficiently as they should.
Outstanding. And before we I don't think that this was a question that was asked, but just to wrap this particular piece up, can you talk about activation from a programming perspective? What are the acute variables for this?
Yeah, so in everything that we've talked about, we always want to make sure that if we gloss over a phrase, it's anchored back into the science of the model, whether it's any part of what we talk about. So going back to what makes activation, it's hopefully the third step of the process, right? We've talked about how sometimes some people can't foam roll and all that, but we want to foam roll, we want to lengthen. Then when we get into activation, it's very specific muscles in a very controlled manner. And what you're going to find is we have a longer eccentric contraction and a longer isometric contraction, because these muscles are geared, and the reason that they've gotten weak is they cannot maintain their firing pattern or their endurance. So it's not a quick, rapid movement of these muscles. It's very slow, very controlled, 8 seconds per rep ideally. So 4 seconds for the eccentric, 2 seconds for the isometric. So they have to hold and grasp that position. A term that Wendy and I would use is like own that position. And then 2 seconds of the concentric motion. So it's very, very specific. And we're looking at doing more repetitions because these are endurance-based muscles. So a minimum of 12 up to 20. And if you can get to 20, if you think about the math, that's 160 seconds. So just make it a little more progressively challenging and maybe get back into that 12 to 15. But once you hit 20, it's time to add some level of, intensity to whether it's more resistance or you're changing your, leverage or whatever to make it just more challenging. You don't need to go over 20 repetitions.
Yeah, so thanks for that explanation. And if since we celebrated the 4th yesterday, if I may paraphrase Master Yoda, we want to teach that muscle to unlearn what it has learned and go through slow, purposeful movement with a lot of repetitions so that it can start to do its job in the global movement pattern. So now thank you. So now, Wendy, let's talk about integration techniques. Tell us what it is and why do we do it? Why is it important to finish our corrective exercise process up with that?
Sure. So the integration techniques are performed after the activation or the positional isometrics, and it involves the use of dynamic total body exercises. So these exercises help re-educate the body back into a functional movement sequence and enhances the functional capacity of the body by increasing multi-planar neuromuscular control. So basically, we're working on coordinating the movement patterns. We know that multi-joint exercises in all planes from both a bilateral and unilateral stance, that's going to help increase the intermuscular coordination and that re-educates the neuromuscular system to maintain the proper alignment during these movement patterns. So integration portion really involves more low load, controlled movements, of course, in the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. And that's going to ensure the joints start and remain in proper alignment and the muscles function in their proper link tension relationships and synergistic recruitment, the recruitment pattern. So we're just making sure that they're moving as optimally as possible. And in this section, basically, we often use the total body movements that combine the lower body as well as upper body, patterns. And that's going to help place the increased stress of the core musculature as well. So basically, we're just taking everything and now kind of combining it and trying to make sure that our body knows how to handle the newfound length as well as activation, and then making sure that we can put it all together so that everything plays nicely.
Thank you for that. Now, I have a couple of questions for you as well. Okay. And this is a follow-up to the webinar series that we did with Aleco regarding combining corrective exercise and Olympic weightlifting. But what I wanted to ask you is, what makes it an integration? What is on the table for integration techniques? What can we use for integration techniques? Is it just, are we limited to just the movements we see in our text, or can we bring anything with purpose?
Well, I mean, obviously, everything with a purpose, because again, every client is specific and individualized. That's why the assessment is so important. And it's also why, the intake is so important, because you want to get the subjective information to find out what is their goal. So basically, I mean, again, corrective exercise does take time. I mean, ideally, you want to start to see something immediately, but you're going to have to continue to work on inhibiting those muscles that are overactive and lengthening the muscles that are weak, trying to reactivate them. And so the beautiful thing about the integration component is, yes, I mean, once you know that you've loosened up muscles that are overactive and woken up muscles, as Marty was saying, waking them up, now that we can think about like the whole neuromuscular, or what's the word I'm looking for? We're trying to look for the coordinated movement patterns. And so if somebody wants to be able to do an Olympic lift, and you've worked on their, foot and ankle complex to get better range of motion within that joint, their hips look pretty good, and they have pretty good, extensibility in their overhead movements, then absolutely you can use anything that you want as long as it makes sense. Sure. And if we think about trying to look at like even a phase 1 workout, I mean, you're going to notice even in that template that we go core, balance, reactive, and then right into a total body. So again, we can still follow that, and that's why the beauty of the corrective exercise model, it really can be integrated into a full workout routine. You just want to make sure that the body is prepared for whatever kind of demands is going to happen in the resistance portion of the workout.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, for clarifying that for us. Now let's move on to some questions that we've gotten over the past few days. And Marty, what I wanted to ask you, and I've gotten this question a lot in social media, but can you go into the difference between intra and intermuscular coordination and tie it into the activation and integration phases of the corrective process?
Yep. And when I learned these philosophies, the way I looked at it was internet, intranet. So, when we communicate throughout the entire world, or all of us, we're using the internet, which that's going to be your integration. Intranet, you might work for a company that has their own internal system where you're only communicating internally. So that's how I remembered my activation is internal. It's primarily going to be just one muscle, as much as you can isolate a muscle. So that's the intramuscular coordination. Then when I start to get everything, as Wendy talked, to now work well together, that's my intermuscular coordination.
Okay, perfect. And can you talk about that? Let's go back to intramuscular coordination and tie this in and help make the connection for our listeners of why we're doing the volume and the way we do the acute, all of the acute variables. Sure. In this sense, and how that ties into how that aids intramuscular coordination.
Yep. So when you look at, again, the muscles that we're going to primarily target, so let's talk about our anterior tibialis, our posterior tibialis, those relatively smaller muscles that have to work for prolonged periods of time. A lot of times they're support or stabilizing joint muscles for those particular joints, whether it's the foot and ankle, whether it's the core, whether it's the shoulder. So they have to work for long periods of time. And if they get fatigued and they don't do their job, now again, muscles don't just completely shut off there, but they're going to drop in their amount of work that they can do when they don't have that endurance and they can't fire properly or optimally. So now all of a sudden, when you look at the rotator cuff, it's a stabilization and endurance structure. It has to work for prolonged periods of time. So that's where, why we have those acute variables exactly set that way, where it could be 2 to 3 sets if needed of 12 to 20 reps, because we really have to build the endurance. Just like, moving up, when we move out of corrective and we go into true stabilization endurance training, again, it's an advanced version in a sense, if you want to look at it that way. That's why we do planks and bridges. We're still working on all those little muscles to be able to create your foundation, right? Just like you have to have that stability and support throughout your entire body. So corrective, you're just identifying a couple weak links and bringing them back up to speed, so then you can progress through the model. So it's just like anytime we focus on it, we describe it. When you build your house, you better have a really solid foundation, and a solid foundation of human movement is the ability to stabilize all the joints for prolonged periods of time in ideal posture without allowing them to get fatigued during the activities that you want to participate in.
Okay, perfect. And now let's talk about intermuscular coordination and why that's important for how integration influences that.
Yeah. So the way I've always described it is I don't train muscles, I train movements. Now, we just talked about intramuscular coordination, and we're talking about trying to isolate a muscle, but you're still doing a movement, whether it's dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Just the movement is much more simplified, and it might be one joint moving in a very methodical manner, where when we look at what Wendy talked about with intermuscular coordination, she was talking about getting multiple joints to move in a sequence, right? Now, I might describe the exercise to somebody as, oh, we're going to train, and I put in the muscle, but I know that there's generally speaking, multiple joints that have to move in a sequence and fire properly in the right time to maximize the movement efficiency. And as I said at the beginning, is I might still move in a similar pattern, but if I'm not getting the muscles to fire in the right sequence and also at the right ratios, then when I move, that's where you see these compensations. And we've already talked about what happens when we get these compensations and we allow those to continue to happen. So that's why we start with the intramuscular coordination, because if you can't control individual joints, it's going to be real hard for you to control multiple joints together.
Okay, and thank you for that, Marty. And Wendy, let's go back to you because it looks like your internet connection is awesome today. So I'm just going to fire off a lot of stuff to you and take advantage of that.
Don't jinx me. Don't jinx me.
Okay. So we had a question about how do you know which muscles to activate. So I'm going to throw you a case. Okay. Someone who has asymmetrical weight shift to the left, and then when you take a look at that single leg squat, there is a little rotation, inward rotation. So what are we activating in that case?
Okay, so when you think about it, if you have a shift to your left, then it's going to be the glute medius on the same side that is going to be underactive, right? I mean, you also want to think about the adductor complex on the opposite side that is allowing that shift, correct? So basically, when you're looking at, the overhead squat and you're gathering all of this information, or even in the single leg squat, I mean, if you see the knee, the knee caving in, that the adductor complex on the side of, or the opposite side of the shift is going to be underactive. But if they're on a single leg and you see that it darts in, it could be overactive too. So again, then you've got conflicting information. So at that point, you really want together as a whole. I mean, the glute medius on the same side is definitely a muscle that we're gonna focus on. But if you don't see anything going on the opposing side with that, well, I shouldn't say the opposite side is going to be overactive. So you're going to inhibit the right side, and then you're going to activate the same side. Does that make sense? Yeah. So basically, you're not going to do the same thing on both sides, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. And the asymmetrical shift is tricky because, again, what's happening in underactive on one side, that means the other side is going to be overactive. And so that's why you really want to get a good understanding of the muscles that you need to focus on. So on a, if you're thinking on a corrective exercise strategy, then again, you're going to inhibit. So you're going to foam roll and lengthen the adductors on the same side, so the left side. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to look at the TFL, because obviously that's also going to be overactive on the same side, so on the left side as well. And then you're going to think about the bicep femoris. And then again, on the opposite side, you've got the glute medius. So that's what you want to look at on the inhibit and lengthen side. And then on the activation side, the glute medius, the glute medius on sorry, it's like I'm trying to think this through without like drawing it out. As Marty says, it's hard without a whiteboard, but the glute medius on the same side is what we're going to activate. And then on the opposite side, adductor complex is what we're going to activate. So it'll be something separate. But again, looking at the solutions table, really kind of identifying the muscles that are involved is going to be super helpful when you're trying to design a program that's going to be beneficial for someone. But again, if you notice that, like in the single leg squat, that the knees cave in and there's, that you've got valgus going on, then obviously you may want to foam roll and lengthen those as well. So again, you kind of have to look at everything as a whole, and every person's going to be different. I don't know if I answered that question right, but
no, you did. You did answer. You did answer that question.
And you get the information from like when you say what to activate. I mean, not even using the asymmetrical shift as an example, but all your information comes from the assessment. So again, that's why the assessment component is so important, because that will tell you exactly what you need to foam roll or inhibit, and then what to lengthen and exactly what to activate.
Okay, so let me follow up. I'm going to ask you an even trickier question.
Fantastic.
So now we're doing this. Let's take into consideration our Group X instructors out there. Okay. So they obviously are there for taking that group exercise class. How do we implement this into the Group X? And specifically, how are we going to get a room of 15, 20 people to do all of these different activation exercises in that group before diving into the Group X sets and reps?
Well, okay. So again, when we're usually talking about this, we're looking at, proper movement patterns and individualized programming. So if you have someone, that has a group, which is obviously a majority of our listeners or people that are coming from NASM, they do Group X. You've got to think too that if you've got 15 people, you could split those people up into like 3 different groups. And you have to think typically what is underactive. And we know that the glutes are often underactive. The glute med is often underactive. This is just over repetitive, being in the field for so long, we see this, these are muscles that are typically underactive. So with that being said, we could have one group do a set of planks or side planks. So that way they're really focusing on the core and the small muscles that protect the spine. And then in another group, you could have them doing side leg lifts or a lateral tube walk if you want to really try to wake up the glute medius. And then you could have them do, another group do bridges. And again, as the instructor, I can look around and watch 5 people do stuff and cue them like, hey, that's great, but make sure your foot's turning in, or hey, make sure you're drawing in, or, if they're in the plank and you don't see their glutes squeezing or you see their heels touching because there's compensations, you can easily cue out of that without being overwhelmed and having all 15 people do the same thing. So, you could do the 15 to 20 reps trying to go over tempos with each group. And then after that, and then you can switch. And so those are 3 great exercises that you could do, and they go from one right into another, right into another. So again, even though it's not individualized, it's still going to be something that you're going to see be very helpful in activating muscles that are usually underactive.
Thank you for that explanation, and that's really brilliant. I go back to when I was a boutique studio owner, and the first thing, it goes back to something that you said, I always assess these people, even though I'm teaching Group X. And then I would throw these people into groups where they were similar. So there were maybe 3 people working on for example, the feet turnout compensation. And I would segment those groups and segment them by their compensation and have them do exactly what you're saying, kind of a general corrective exercise program for that particular segment. So thanks for that explanation. Bottom line, people, it goes back to, assessment and then being a little creative in how you group your clients to make that work in a group setting. So Marty, I'm going to go back to you and ask you what I think is it depends question, but what is the best integration exercise that a beginner can do?
Well, it depends, but I had to say that. You set me up for that. So One thing you got to focus on, what do you have in your facility, right? Do you have a cable machine? Do you have a stability ball? But, what we're going to be generally looking for is some type of, generally speaking, a squatting motion that's generally assisted if it's a beginner, because it'll help them learn the squatting pattern. So I love a squat to row, because if I can do the row, now I'm getting into full extension of my shoulder blades, good posture at the top. It's going to force my hips into extension. And as I go down into the triple flexion component, the holding on to the handlebar or the handles or whatever I'm holding on to is going to allow me to, to offset maybe my weakness in my core, allows also for me to get better positioning between my, shin and spine. So it's a awesome exercise. You can't go wrong with a squat to row. Stability ball, if that's what works for you, because right now you might be training somebody in their home and they don't have the ability to necessarily have a cable machine or anything that could offset their load like that. The suspension training, I like that as well, because again, you can kind of learn how to mirror that with the squat to row. I'll do, a squat pattern to a row, even with the suspension training devices. So those are kind of my three go-to begin with. As someone progresses, I like using a low step up. Again, when we start the step ups, I don't go to 8, 10, 12 inches right away. I'm cool with using a 2, a 4, or 6, because I'm starting to teach that progression on towards a single leg. And then having to create their balance and their core and their integrity. I like scaption. To me, if they had any type of overhead, anything with their lats or their shoulder, I don't go to a press right away. I would go more into scaption, because I'm still going to take a couple weeks maybe to get their full lat extensibility. Doesn't mean you can't. But again, getting creative again, if they have really tight lats and I want to do something overhead, I'll do one arm at a time compared to both arms, because I can put one arm above my head and not have to have so much restriction on my lats as if I do both. But again, you got scaption there as well. So, a lot of different ways you can look at it. But as you said, it depends on the person's abilities, their assessment, and now in this environment, especially what you have around you.
Yeah. So for those of you listening, if we made the perfect Venn diagram of this, one circle is what do you have in your gym? List out all of that stuff. Then it goes back to what your client wants, and whether that's just general health or are they competing in something. You have to take all of that into consideration when you make your program. And that final circle is what do they need? What exactly, like Marty and Wendy have said this entire series. What does that assessment tell? What does that assessment tell you? What are their abilities? What can they control at that time? And that's how you pick your best integration exercise. So let's follow up with you, Mark, and ask you more about specific exercises. So when we talk about things like the glute medius, since we brought up the asymmetrical weight shift, is the glute bridge or a lateral tube walk an activation or integration exercise? And how do you, if they're different, how do you make the decision of which exercise goes where in that continuum?
Once again, it depends. And what I mean by it depends on that person. So when we have corrective exercise, it doesn't mean that they're going to be so dysfunctional that they can't do anything. And again, just like anybody else, somebody's stability and their strength and their power is all on a continuum. So if you're dealing with a professional athlete, their activation may be with a 25 or 30 pound dumbbell for a glute bridge, right? To some people, that would look like a strength exercise. But if these are people squatting 500, 600, 700 pounds, that's what they might be able to handle, 25, 30, 40 pounds for 15 reps at that real slow controlled tempo. So again, kind of going back to what you just explained, we got to kind of pick, where's this current person? What does activation mean to them? What does integration mean to them? But when we look at it, generally speaking, tube walking for a lot of people, it's one of those ones that's going to split, right? So Wendy and I had a conversation about this earlier, is there's a lot going on to do a lateral tube walking properly. So if they can't control their core, if they can't control their posture, if they can't control the height that you want them to go at, and if they take a step out to their right and their left knee caves into adduction because the band's pulling them, then that's not an activation technique. You may need to get their glute medius fired up with a single leg, hip abduction, or a side plank or something that is a little more focused, then see if they can use the tube walkies and integration. But if someone's been working, Wendy, I know she crushes people with the tube walking in the right way. She always dials that in. So for somebody else that has been with Wendy or somebody like that for a period of time, that's now an activation technique. And then she can go do something a little more challenging for their integration. So, some people get confused when they see that. Of course, a dorsiflexion, anterior tib, always going to be pretty much an activation technique. But there are a few of those that can, ride that fence. But it's not that we're throwing out the science. We just understand progressions and regressions and what's appropriate for that person. But it always is going to come back to they have to be able to do the right amount of repetitions with the right amount of tempo. And that is really going to dictate what happens. If I pick the tube walking and they can't follow that 4-2-2 tempo without losing their form and technique, I need to regress. And if I need to regress them back to something on the ground, then that's what's appropriate for them at that point. No problem with that.
Okay. And speaking of progressions, regressions, Marty, what are some of those progressions, regressions for the glute bridge?
Yep. So I've had clients, honestly, that they can't even do a glute bridge without their hamstring or low back cramping up. Now, they're not injured. This was just they did not know how to fire those muscles. So I have them do isometric holds. I think, Wendy, you've called that deer in headlights, where you're just doing your glute squeezes. And you'd be shocked how sometimes you have to change the position of them because, some positions they can do it in, some positions they can't. So, I've given what I call accidental exercise, like every time you're in the car at a red light, start squeezing your glutes, right? So sometimes it can just be flat out the isometric hold. Then from there, we're going to go with 2 legs up, 2 legs down. Then what I like to do is really break down the progressions and regressions is I would go 2 legs up, 1 leg down before I'd start going 1 leg up, 1 leg down. So then I go from, once they can go 2 legs up, 1 leg down, then I have them to go 1 leg up, 1 leg down. And then, that's a nice way to get into those progressions. Then again, if someone can hold a 5, 10, 15 pound dumbbell there and just are a rock star and do those 12 to 20 repetitions, that's awesome. Because Wendy's heard me say this. I've never found somebody that had overactive glutes yet where they're like, I need to inhibit your glutes because you're way too, you got way too good of a movement pattern firing your glutes. So we absolutely put a lot of glute work in, and we want that endurance, and we want them to be able to maintain those, firing patterns for long periods of time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, we had a question come in from Justin. Thank you for hopping on today, Justin. And Justin wants to know how we incorporate CES into 30-minute sessions with clients that we're seeing only once or twice a week. I want both of you to give your perspective on that, but let's start with you, Wendy.
Well, I used to work in a facility where we did 30 to 45-minute sessions. And so, obviously that is very typical. And if I do a lot of pre-work with someone and they only have an hour, meaning because I'm a manual therapist, I may do a lot of manual work up front, and then we have to get into the activation as well as their programming. So for me, again, as soon as they get done foam rolling and stretching, I immediately have, and again, every exercise is dependent upon the assessment, but as Marty just said, very typically, you're going to notice that people's glutes are very underactive. And so I'll have them go into a glute bridge. I do have my clients go into a lateral tube walking or a clamshell or sideline, leg lift, or even cable abduction, because again, we know that their glute medius is usually weak. And then I can do, I can go right into my integration exercises. And if I only have 30 minutes, the beautiful thing about integration exercises is that they are total body exercises. So I can get a bunch of muscles worked at the same time if I incorporated anywhere from 2 to 4 total exercises. So for example, I go from, my glute bridges right into my lateral tube walking, right into maybe a step up to balance to curled overhead press. I could do something like a single leg Romanian deadlift into a scaption. I could do, there's a lot of, I could do a side lying lunge with rotation, like cable rotation. So there's a lot of different things that I could do where I can pinpoint specific muscle groups, get a total body workout, and they're happy because we targeted everything in a short amount of time. And so you can look at all this stuff as kind of like a, as a positive, even in the short, in the short time frame that you have, because again, total body exercises get your heart rate up. It's very, very challenging. And because we're doing the 4-2-1 tempo, or we're slowing everything down, these muscles are firing, and it's very, very challenging for the client. So then they feel like they got a really good workout.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Wendy. And Marty, what do you think about that?
Very similar philosophies. So, instead of just kind of repeating it, some other ways to attack it is try to get them to do their homework, get there even 5 minutes earlier, right? And at least if they can get their foam roll out of the way, or a couple of their lengthening techniques, anything that they can get out of the way ahead of time. Now, what I'm going to tell fitness professionals is don't allow them not to do it, because now you've just said it's not important. I've had clients that walk in like, oh, I didn't have time, and then they just want to rush right to the body of their workout. I might adjust their workout, but I'm going to force them to do it, because I'm going to reiterate that these are the rules you're going to play by. So in the first time you do that, they'll get in early and they'll get their stuff done if they can. So I try to get them to do as much of it as possible. And then exactly like when he said, try to be very creative with my integration techniques where I can keep them moving, keep their heart rate up. And then going back to what we always talk about in the CES is, what's the most important compensation I need to address? That's the biggest issue that I have to face in that workout, or biggest issue that can clean up the most of other things. And if there's some nice to-dos, I might sprinkle that in, in their active rest phase. Like, for example, let's say it's all glute medius that I really need to target with my activation, but I know their anterior tib could use some work. Well, as they are walking back and forth sets, I have them do like the heel walk, where they're putting their anterior tib in an isometric position and they're walking that way, because at least I'm getting some firing of their anterior tib. So you'll learn some of those little tricks of the trade, or I might throw in cobras as part of their exercise for the mid trap, low trap. But I might have really had to fire, the activation on their glute medius, because without that, their whole movement system kind of doesn't work. So that's where there's the science and the art that we've talked about, but I'm always sprinkling it in, as much as possible.
Great, thank you for that. And I'll just summarize both of you, because you brought up very good points. Number one, you have to be creative. Number two, you have to prioritize and pick the compensation that's kind of driving the most stuff. And you may have to adjust your workout so that you don't do anything that's going to feed some of those other compensations. And I like what you said, Marty, about accidental exercise. This stuff doesn't, once you're moving and you're in the session and you need to pick up some of those other movement segments, you don't have to do this necessarily in a linear fashion. Like, Zeus isn't going to lightning bolt you from Olympus. You are allowed to move this stuff around. Yep. So that your client can get all of the stuff done. It can be an active rest. So thank you both for that explanation. And I'm looking at the questions, and I have one more for you, Wendy. Now, life takes place in 3D. We've talked a lot, given a lot of sagittal plane explanations, demonstrations. How do we know when to progress into different planes of motion in an integration exercise?
Well, of course, we're always looking for proper movement patterns during every exercise that we do. So if your client owns, as I said, and I know Marty brought up just a second ago, a two-legged exercise with minimal challenge to their core, so let's say like a ball squat, then you can progress them to the alternating or staggered stance exercise, such as the step up, and then progress them to a lunge, and then the single leg squat. But as we know, the sagittal plane is usually the easiest for most of our clients. So that's usually where we start people in, and that's totally fine. But I mean, as you said, we move in all three planes of motion. So once this client seems to understand the proper movement patterns, you're not seeing a lot of compensations, then start to put them in the frontal plane. Start to getting them moving side to side, and then how does their body react to that? And then again, start training their body into how to move properly in the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints in the frontal plane, and then the transverse plane. Because again, we want to keep training our core, like our movement patterns, and make sure that we're following the same sequence. Again, go from 2 legs to side step ups, and then a side lunge, and then different things like that. So So again, being creative, and the more you can get them moving in 3 planes from the beginning, that's great. But if you know that they're really struggling in the sagittal plane, it may take a few sessions before you can start getting them moving in the different ones. But it definitely you want that to be a focal point and not just keep them in the same plane that they already know how to move in, easily, if you will.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Now, we have a question that came in from Megan, and thank you, Megan, for hopping on today and listening. And Megan's question is there a way to alter the steps in groups of 60 plus people? Okay, so this is a question for both of you, but go back to your days of working with a football team. You probably have 48, 50 people out there in warm-ups before practice, so we're not going to lug around 50 plus foam rollers. So I'll continue. She works with fire recruits for two-hour training sessions, who do 2-hour training sessions, and then they sit the rest of the day. And of course, for her budget, buying 60 foam rollers is not in the books right now. So what can we do to follow the continuum, but get all of these recruits taken care of? Let's start with you, Marty.
Yeah, so I've worked with large groups like that before. So one, you're going to go through your assessments, and we do what we call red flag people. If we saw people that moved really inefficiently, we would give them a lot of homework to do on their own where, whether they were injured or not at this point, that wasn't the case. It's just they met a criteria where we're like, okay, you need to come in with us and learn your individual workout. Then for the group, we didn't foam roll everybody. Now, again, you can encourage people and do a session on how to do foam rolling and teach them it and encourage them and try to maybe see if you can help them buy these in bulk so it's less expensive. But that's something you're going to teach it to them, tell them why they should do it, and get them to do it at home, and maybe when they get home after their long day as well. And then when you go through the progressions, just like we've talked about, you go through your static into active and then into dynamic, and pick the muscle groups that tend to be overactive for most people, which is the calves, the hip flexors, the adductors, the lats, and pecs. And just, then throw a core stabilization exercise in there, maybe some glute bridges, and then you can get off into more dynamic stuff. So when you're dealing with that type of group, that's still a great approach.
Okay, and how would you approach that, Wendy?
I'm gonna follow exactly what Marty said. I mean, ideally, even if you don't have 60 foam rollers, maybe you can ask the firehouses, to try to have some laying around. So when they're not in session, maybe they can foam roll and stuff, when they're in their 24-hour shift. And so, again, that would be their homework, and they would have to take some kind of ownership of doing some of that on their own. However, if you are doing 60 people at once, like Marty said, I mean, you may not foam roll, and it's okay, because again, there's going to be certain situations where you're not going to have any kind of implement to use in the inhibit section. So you may have to bypass that and go right into the static stretching. And, if it is a group and you didn't do any individualized any individualized assessments, which obviously in this case, probably not, you would look at the most common compensations that you would think that a firefighter would have. I mean, they're lifting really heavy hoses, they're climbing up ladders, they're moving things around all the time. So again, you would think about the muscles that would be overactive in their particular, in this case, either sport, if you're thinking sport, or in her case, the firefighters, and then statically stretch it and then go right into activating again, the common ones based like Marty just said. So, you could do planks, you could do the bridges, you could do side planks. I mean, those are all really challenging, and they're all really good activation exercises, and then go into, some kind of integration. And it could be, some kind of like side lunge to balance and then into a scaption. I mean, they don't have to have weights for some of this stuff, because again, if you know that they're weak and you're trying to integrate things together, it's still going to be very, very challenging before they get into the actual workout.
Yeah, and I can also address the activation in session. Actually, before I do that, I know, Marty, you have a hard cutoff in like 2 minutes here. So why don't you give us what your takeaways are for this session today, and then tell us how we can get in touch with you after this is all over.
Absolutely. So, I think when you go back in the whole sequence of this is that there's so many really amazing features from each step in the model, and there's not one that's more important than the other. And that's what the research shows. And that's why I love the NASM content, because it's not an opinion. It's science. It's just learn the science, then master the science so you know what phase you're in, how to progress people, what the acute variables are. But then it's just really, Wendy and I'll tell you, we've been at this for over 20 years with this information, and we're still kind of going, wow, what if I do it this way? But when we say that, it's always how to apply the science in a unique, new way and get more bang for our buck. So that's the art of it. But if you're not using it every single day, you get in maybe bad habits or go back to the habits before you took the course and passed the test. So really just you're your first client and make everything about the model, and you'll just see how valuable it is. So, and then to get a hold of me, the easiest way is on Instagram is miller.marty72. And then also email is marty.miller@nasm.org.
All right. Thanks, Marty. I know you have to hop off, so
Awesome.
Thank you for joining us as usual. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
And you have a great day, rest of your day. And
thanks, everybody.
We'll see you Thursday.
You got to look forward to it. And Wendy, you'll do a great job, closing it up as always.
All right.
Awesome, guys. Take care and be well.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. So, Wendy, I'm going to follow up a little bit on Megan's question, and you can give me your hand signals, tell me to cut it off, stop, whatever it is you want to do. And this is going to be a little controversial. Now, you're a manual therapist, and we understand that doing the pin and stretch technique, for example, doesn't require a ton of pressure from the foam roller. We're not taking a steamroller over that muscle to elicit the response that we need to get this to work. Am I on the right track? Have I said anything unsafe yet?
No.
No. Now, working with groups like that, now it's going to take a little bit of coaching and cueing. I do know that she has access, maybe not to 60 foam rollers, but she has access to 480 fingers and 120 thumbs. So quite possibly during the warm-up when we're doing inhibition, you can have those firefighters just probe with their own fingers in the belly of the muscle without going too hard and just doing a simple pin and stretch technique. You don't have to have am I still safe, first of all?
You are.
Okay.
I mean, to an extent. I mean, again, you want to be careful, too, because obviously, as a manual therapist, we're very, we're licensed, and again, you have to make sure that they are very clear on the pressure point. Like, as you were saying, you want to make sure that they don't go past a 6 or 7 on a scale of 10, or you're really not going to elicit, the gains that you're hoping to get. So, but go ahead.
And that's a very good point, and that's why I wanted to be clear in the very beginning. This is going to take some coaching, understanding all of the contraindications where we don't want to put pressure. Obviously, we don't want to put pressure into the joint space over a blood vessel, over any nervous tissue, or any place where it can cause more harm. And definitely, we don't need a lot of tension. I would even say 3 or 4 can get the job done.
Right.
But just holding on to that, and just being a little creative, doing a little education up front, being a little creative, you can still follow the steps in the process safely. It's definitely may not be ideal, and definitely not going to do the same job as a foam roller or one of those hyper-ice vibrational devices, but you can still get some of that work done doing exactly like you said, focusing on the high yield muscle groups, getting into the calves, getting appropriately into the hip flexors. You don't want to take your thumb and dig it across your nervous tissue, definitely not into that femoral triangle and impinge an artery or anything like that, but you can put your fist in a TFL and do some pin and stretch techniques without any injury. So do everything that Marty and Wendy said, Megan, and you can take your athletes through that process pretty safely. So we are at the end today, Wendy. What are your takeaways from this webinar?
Well, I mean, I think, again, just remember that all of this is a continuum. And so, we are splitting this up, and, the assessment really is what dictates what you should and shouldn't do, meaning, what are the right areas to foam roll? What are the right areas to lengthen? And again, we're basing that off of what we saw that caused the compensation. And then again, what's allowing the compensation is what we're terming as weak or underactive. And that's where this webinar really, comes into play, that we want to activate those muscles that have shown to be weak or underactive. And then we do the integration by putting it all together. Again, just we want to think of, if you use a car, you've got an engine and you've got tires and you've got the body of the car, but if you don't put it all together, it's not going to run smoothly. And so that's kind of how you want to think of your body, that there's a lot of little pieces that, we term the intermuscular, coordination stuff today that we were kind of pinpointing. And then it's we want to think about everything together, and trying to put it together as a whole to get everything to work, in proper neuromuscular efficiency, having the right muscles fire at the right time and the right plane of motion. And again, this continuum is great because it really does build upon what's going to be going on in the actual workout. And you're just helping a client move better, feel better, which again is going to allow them to perform better. And so I think the takeaway is just kind of get to know the solutions table, really get a good understanding of what muscles are underactive and overactive. And then at that point, apply, this 4-step process, and then go into the workout that is appropriate for your client. Because remember, every client is different. That's why we do an assessment with everyone, so we can get a really good foundation of where they're starting and where they want to go.
Okay, and how do we find you? Ask a lot of follow-up questions after this.
So my Instagram is wendy.batts13. My Twitter is wendybatts13. And my email is wendy.batts@nasm.org.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always, Wendy. And I hope the weather is okay for you down there, where you are. And you have a great rest of the day. And thank you, everybody who hopped on and stuck with us for the full hour. We'll see you next time.